Black pilot told to sit in economy, not knowing he's the owner's son. The morning sun peeked through the airport windows as Darren Evans made his way through the terminal, rolling his carry-on bag behind him. At 32, he carried himself with an easy confidence that came from years of walking these same halls, though usually in a pilot's uniform rather than the comfortable jeans and navy blazer he wore today. His worn leather messenger bag, a gift from his father on his first day as a licensed pilot, hung at his side, containing his laptop and the conference materials he'd need later. The familiar buzz of the airport surrounded him, families hauling luggage, business travelers talking on phones, and the occasional announcement echoing through the terminal. Darren couldn't help but smile as he passed under a massive advertisement for Evans Airlines, featuring their newest fleet edition. His father's company had grown from a small regional carrier to a respected national airline, and though Darren preferred to keep quiet about his connection to the business, he felt a surge of pride every time he saw their logo. Making his way to the first-class check-in counter, Darren exchanged friendly nods with several ground crew members who recognized him. He'd made it a point over the years to learn the names and faces of as many employees as possible, though today he was grateful that the check-in agent was new and treated him just like any other passenger. There is something refreshing about being anonymous sometimes, about seeing the airline through a customer's eyes rather than as the owner's son. The security line moved quickly, and Darren found himself with extra time before boarding. He stopped at a coffee shop, ordering a simple black coffee and settling into a corner seat where he could watch the morning operations unfold. A family with young kids caught his attention. A little girl pressed her face against the window, pointing excitedly at a plane taxiing past. It reminded him of his own childhood, when his father would take him to work, letting him sit in the cockpit of parked planes and dream about flying. His phone buzzed with a text from his dad. "Have a good flight, son. Let me know how the conference goes." Simple and straightforward, just like his father. Darren typed back a quick thanks, smiling at how his father still checked in on him before every flight, whether he was flying the plane or riding as a passenger. When boarding time approached, Darren gathered his things and headed to the gate. He could see their aircraft through the windows, one of their newer Boeing 737s, its fresh paint gleaming in the morning light. A small group had already formed near the gate, and Darren took his place in line, listening to the casual conversations around him. Someone complained about the weather delay on their last flight. Another passenger bragged about getting upgraded to first class with his points. The gate agent called for first-class boarding, and Darren moved forward with a small group of passengers. He walked down the jet bridge, feeling the familiar transition from terminal to aircraft. The smell of fresh coffee and clean upholstery greeted him as he stepped aboard, ducking slightly out of habit, though he didn't really need to. "Good morning," he said quietly to the flight attendant at the door, who returned his greeting with a professional smile. The first-class cabin was still mostly empty, just a couple of passengers settling into their seats. Darren found a spot, 2A, and stored his carry-on in the overhead bin. The leather seat felt familiar. He'd helped select this interior design himself, though none of the other passengers would know that. An older man in a business suit was already seated across the aisle, tapping away at his laptop. In the row behind, a woman in workout clothes was arranging her things, probably heading to a vacation or a retreat. Darren liked imagining where people might be going, what stories brought them onto this particular flight on this particular morning. He pulled out his phone one last time before the flight, scrolling through his emails. The conference agenda showed several interesting panels on industry innovation and sustainability, topics he was particularly passionate about. As more passengers filed past heading to economy, Darren observed how they interacted with the crew, how they managed their bags, making mental notes about potential improvements to their boarding process. The familiar sounds of pre-flight preparation filled the cabin, overhead bins clicking shut, the galley carts being secured, flight attendants checking seatbelts and offering drinks. Darren declined the pre-takeoff beverage, preferring to just sit back and take in the experience. He'd flown this route countless times from the cockpit, but seeing it from this angle gave him new perspectives on their service. A young flight attendant passed through, checking seat belts with practiced efficiency. Darren noticed how she maintained eye contact with each passenger, offering a genuine smile. exactly the kind of personal touch his father had always emphasized. The captain's voice came over the speaker, announcing their flight time and route. Darren recognized the voice as belonging to Captain Martinez, one of their most experienced pilots. Looking out the window, Darren watched the ground crew finishing their preparations. He knew every step of their choreographed routine, could practically hear their radio communications in his head. A bag loader beeped as it backed away from the cargo hold, and marshals with their bright orange wands began to position themselves for pushback. It was like watching a familiar dance from a new angle, and Darren found himself appreciating the complexity of it all in a different way. The plane had just pushed back from the gate when Lisa, a flight attendant Darren hadn't seen before, started making her way through the first-class cabin. She moved with the precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times, checking seatbelts and ensuring tray tables were up. When she reached Darren's row, something in her expression changed. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying that customer service sweetness that didn't quite reach her eyes. "May I see your boarding pass?" Darren pulled up the mobile pass on his phone, routine he'd done countless times. Lisa studied it longer than necessary, her forehead creasing slightly. The businessman across the aisle glanced up from his laptop, then quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. "There seems to be some confusion," Lisa said, lowering her voice but not quite enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing. "This section is for first-class passengers." She emphasized first class in a way that made Darren's stomach tighten. "Yes, I understand," Darren replied calmly, gesturing to the boarding pass still displayed on his phone. "That's why I'm seated here." Lisa's smile tightened. "Sir, perhaps there was a mistake at check-in. Let me help you find your correct seat in the main cabin." She wasn't asking anymore, but stating what she clearly believed was a fact. The plane continued its taxi to the runway, the regular bumps and engine noise creating a strange backdrop to this increasingly uncomfortable situation. A couple more passengers were watching now, some trying to be subtle about it, others openly staring at the scene unfolding. "There's no mistake," Darren said, keeping his voice level despite the familiar burn of frustration rising in his chest. "I have a first-class ticket for seat 2A. This is my seat." A woman 2 rows up had turned around completely now, her magazine forgotten in her lap. The businessman across the aisle had closed his laptop, suddenly finding the safety card in his seat back pocket intensely interesting. The awkward tension in the cabin was becoming palpable. Lisa's professional smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "Sir, I'm sure we can sort this out. If you'll just gather your things, I can help you find your proper seat before takeoff." Her tone suggested she was doing him a favor, being patient with someone who clearly didn't belong in her section. Darren felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He'd been here before, in different places, different situations, but always the same underlying assumption. He thought about his father's words from years ago. Sometimes the best response is just being exactly who you are. "I understand you're doing your job," Darren said, his voice remaining steady, "but I am in my correct seat. Would you like to check with the gate agent?" He knew the flight manifest would confirm his booking, but the fact that he had to prove his right to be there stung. A few whispers filtered through the cabin. An elderly woman across the aisle leaned forward, peering at the situation with undisguised interest. Behind him, someone muttered something too low to hear, followed by a quiet laugh that made Darren's neck heat up. Lisa shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to back down. "Sir, I'm very familiar with our first-class manifest, and I'm sure there's been a mix-up. It would be easier for everyone if we could handle this quickly." Her tone had shifted from customer service pleasant to slightly condescending, the kind of voice someone might use with a difficult child. The plane slowed as it joined the line for takeoff, other aircraft visible through the windows as they waited their turn. The regular pre-flight announcements began playing over the speakers, creating a bizarre contrast to the tension in the cabin. A flight attendant at the back of first class was watching the interaction now, whispering something to another crew member. "I fly with this airline frequently," Darren said, each word measured and calm despite the emotions churning inside him. "I can assure you I'm in the correct seat." Lisa's smile faltered slightly. "Sir, I don't want to have to escalate this situation." The implied threat hung in the air, heavy with assumption and prejudice. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others seemed to be enjoying the drama unfolding before them. A man in the row behind Darren cleared his throat. If he has a ticket for that seat, what's the problem? The unexpected support caught both Darren and Lisa off guard. Another passenger nodded in agreement, though most remained silent observers. The seatbelt sign dinged on, accompanied by the usual chime. Lisa glanced at it, then back at Darren, clearly torn between protocol and her conviction that he didn't belong in first class. The morning sun streaming through the windows highlighted the discomfort on her face, the way her hands clasped and unclasped as she tried to decide her next move. As the plane idled in the takeoff queue, Darren felt the weight of everyone's attention. He could have ended this right away by pulling out his company ID or mentioning his father's name, but something made him hold back. Years of similar experiences flashed through his mind. The security guard who followed him around an upscale store, the host who assumed he was a delivery driver at a restaurant, the countless small moments that built up over time. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I understand you're trying to do your job, but I'm not going to move from my correctly assigned seat." He held her gaze steadily, refusing to show the frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. Lisa's composure cracked slightly. She clearly hadn't expected such steady resistance from someone she'd assumed would be easily intimidated. "Sir, I'm only trying to avoid any confusion," she started, but her voice trailed off as more passengers began to openly watch the exchange. The businessman across the aisle had finally given up pretending to read his safety card. "Look," he said, addressing Lisa, "if the man has a first-class ticket, what's the issue?" His words carried the weight of someone used to being listened to, and Lisa's attention snapped to him. She started, then stopped, glancing between Darren and the other passenger. The plane moved forward a few feet in the takeoff queue, the engines rumbling beneath their feet. Another flight attendant, an older woman named Sarah according to her name tag, approached cautiously. "Is everything all right up here?" Sarah asked, her eyes taking in the scene. Darren recognized her from previous flights, but knew she wouldn't remember him. He'd always kept a low profile, even when flying as a passenger. "This gentleman seems to be confused about his seating assignment," Lisa said, her voice carrying a hint of desperation now. She turned to Sarah as if seeking backup, but her colleague's expression remained neutral. Darren pulled out his phone again, pulling up not just his boarding pass, but his frequent flyer profile. "I fly with this airline regularly," he repeated, his tone remaining professional despite the growing discomfort of the situation. "I'm happy to show you my documentation again." A woman in her 60s, sitting by the window across the aisle, spoke up. "I've been watching this whole thing, and I don't understand what the problem is." "The young man has shown his ticket twice now." Her voice carried the slight tremor of age, but was clear and determined. The plane crept forward again. Through the windows, Darren could see they were getting closer to their takeoff position. Soon, all flight attendants would need to be seated for departure. The time pressure seemed to add to Lisa's anxiety. Sarah stepped closer, speaking quietly to her colleague. "Lisa, if he has a valid boarding pass." She left the sentence hanging, giving Lisa a meaningful look. But Lisa seemed unable to let it go, her professional demeanor cracking further under the weight of her assumptions. "It's just that." Lisa lowered her voice, though not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing. "This section is reserved for our premium customers." The implications in her tone made several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Darren felt a familiar mix of emotions, anger at the prejudice, sadness at its persistence, and a strange sort of determination. He thought about all the young Black professionals who might find themselves in similar situations, who might not have the same ability to stay calm or stand their ground. A young woman in workout clothes, who had been quietly observing from her seat behind Darren, leaned forward. "I can't believe this is happening," she said, shaking her head. "It's 2024, for heaven's sake." The comment hung in the air, making the subtext of the situation explicit. Lisa's face flushed red, but she still didn't back down completely. Instead, She looked increasingly trapped between her original assumptions and the growing support for Darren from other passengers. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing they were third in line for takeoff. The timing forced Darren to make a decision. He could continue letting this play out, watching Lisa dig herself deeper into her prejudiced assumptions, or he could end it now. He thought about his father's words again, about being exactly who you are. Sarah, the older flight attendant, seemed to sense the need to resolve this quickly. She stepped closer to Darren's seat, her manner apologetic. "Sir, I'm sure we can sort this out. Your boarding pass clearly shows." But before she could finish, Darren made his choice. He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out his airline ID, holding it where both flight attendants could see it. He didn't announce it loudly or make a scene. He simply held it up, letting the information sink in. Lisa's eyes widened as she read the ID, recognizing not just Darren's status as a senior pilot, but his last name. The realization hit her like a physical force, and she took a small step back. Sarah's expression shifted too, recognition dawning in her eyes. "I didn't want to make a big deal about this," Darren said quietly, still keeping his voice level. "I was hoping we could resolve this without having to bring up who I am. I'd rather be treated with respect because it's the right thing to do, not because of my last name or position." The immediate area had gone completely quiet, the only sound the steady rumble of the engines. Lisa's face had drained of color, her hands trembling slightly as she struggled to process what was happening. Other passengers were watching with expressions ranging from satisfaction to embarrassment, some avoiding eye contact altogether. The silence in the cabin felt heavy enough to touch. Lisa stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, the reality of her mistake clearly sinking in. The ID in Darren's hand might as well have been a spotlight, illuminating all her assumptions and prejudices in stark detail. "Mr. Evans," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I had no idea." Her hands fluttered nervously at her sides, like birds unsure where to land. The professional mask she'd worn earlier had completely crumbled, replaced by raw embarrassment. "That's kind of the point," Darren replied softly, tucking the ID back into his bag. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with respect." He kept his voice gentle, not wanting to humiliate her despite everything that had happened. The plane moved forward again, the engine's rumble filling the momentary silence. Sarah stepped in, placing a light hand on Lisa's arm. "Lisa, why don't you help Jenny in the back with the final checks?" Her tone was kind but firm, offering Lisa an escape from the situation she'd created. Lisa nodded quickly, looking relieved at the chance to retreat. As Lisa hurried away, the other passengers seemed to release a collective breath. The businessman across the aisle shook his head, muttering something under his breath. The older woman who had spoken up earlier caught Darren's eye and gave him a sad, understanding smile. "Mr. Evans," Sarah said, her voice carrying genuine regret, "I want to apologize for this entire situation. This isn't what we stand for as an airline." She glanced in the direction Lisa had gone, then back to Darren. "Would you like me to make a formal report?" Darren thought about it for a moment. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, waiting to see how he'd handle this part. "No," he said finally. "I think what happened here today might be more valuable as a learning experience." He glanced around the cabin, noting how some passengers quickly looked away while others met his gaze with newfound respect. The plane taxied into position for takeoff, and Sarah had to wrap up the conversation. "Please let me know if you need anything during the flight, Mr. Evans," she said, her tone carrying both respect and embarrassment. As she turned to head back to her jump seat, several passengers watched her go, the atmosphere in the cabin still charged with unspoken thoughts and emotions. As the engines roared to full power for takeoff, Darren looked out his window, reflecting on what had just happened. He could see his own reflection faintly in the glass, the same face, the same person he'd always been, now viewed completely differently by everyone around him just because they knew his last name. The woman in workout clothes behind him leaned forward again once they were airborne. "That was really gracious of you," she said quietly. "I'm Amy Chun, by the way. I work in corporate training, and what just happened, well, it's exactly the kind of real-world example we try to discuss in our diversity workshops. Darren turned slightly in his seat to acknowledge her. It happens more often than people might think, he replied, usually just in more subtle ways. He noticed other passengers trying to listen and while pretending not to Air bodies tilted slightly toward the conversation. It's one thing to talk about unconscious bias in a training room, Amy continued, her professional interest clearly piqued. But seeing it play out like this, it really drives the point home. She paused, then added more quietly, though I'm sorry you had to experience it. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the usual shuffle of passengers reaching for bags and devices began. But there was something different about the atmosphere now. The regular barrier of polite indifference between first-class passengers had cracked, replaced by a shared experience that seemed to demand acknowledgement. The businessman across the aisle closed his laptop completely and turned to Darren. James Whitaker, he said, extending his hand. I've been flying for 30 years, and I've seen things like this before, but I've never seen anyone handle it with such dignity. He shook his head. It's your airline, for heaven's sake. You could have had her fired on the spot. That wouldn't solve the underlying problem, Darren replied, accepting the handshake. And it might just reinforce certain stereotypes about. He let the sentence hang, but everyone knew what he meant. Sarah returned with a fresh round of drinks, her service notably more attentive than usual. As she served Darren his club soda, she paused. Mr. Evans, I've worked for your father's airline for 15 years. I should have recognized you, and I'm sorry I didn't step in sooner. Darren looked up at her. You know what's interesting? The fact that you think you should have treated me differently because you should have recognized me. That's part of the problem we need to fix. His words weren't accusatory, just thoughtful, and Sarah's expression showed she understood the point he was making. From the back of first class, Darren could see Lisa trying to keep busy with service preparations, her movements jerky and uncertain. Every now and then, she would glance in his direction, her face still flushed with embarrassment. He knew this moment would stay with her, and he hoped it would lead to genuine reflection rather than just shame. The flight settled into its cruising altitude, but the usual quiet of first class had been replaced by a different kind of energy. Conversations sparked up around Darren, some directly related to what had happened, others seemingly casual but carrying an undercurrent of newfound awareness. A man in his 50s who had been silently watching everything unfold finally spoke up. You know, I keep thinking about how many times I might have seen something like this and just stayed quiet. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but his words carried across several rows. You tell yourself it's not your business, or maybe you're not sure what you're seeing, so you just look away. The elderly woman who had defended Darren earlier nodded. I'm glad I said something, though I wish I'd spoken up sooner. She adjusted her reading glasses, looking around at the other passengers. I remember when they wouldn't let my Chinese daughter-in-law into the country club where I'd been a member for 20 years. I was so angry then, but this felt just as wrong. Sarah came through with the breakfast service, her manner warm but professionally subdued. As she placed Darren's meal in front of him, her hands were steady but her eyes kept darting to his face, as if trying to memorize it to prevent any future mistakes. Other crew members who passed through first class now showed a similar mix of excessive courtesy and nervous energy. Amy, still sitting behind Darren, was taking notes on her phone. Would you mind, she asked carefully, if I used this situation as a case study? No names or airline details, of course. But the way it unfolded, the responses, the resolution, it's powerful stuff. Sure. Darren replied to Amy's request, cutting into his omelet. Just remember that for some of us, this isn't a case study. It's Tuesday. His words weren't bitter, just matter of fact, but they seemed to hit home with several passengers who were listening. James Whitaker, the businessman who had introduced himself earlier, put down his coffee cup. You know what really gets me? I fly first class twice a week, minimum. When I walk on a plane, nobody ever questions whether I belong here. He gestured to his expensive suit. But I've seen flight attendants do double takes with doctors, lawyers, even other business executives who don't fit their mental picture of a first-class passenger. A flight attendant neither Darren nor the other passengers had seen before passed through, doing a double take when she saw him. Word had clearly spread through the crew. She hurried past, whispering something to Sarah at the galley. Sarah shook her head firmly, and the new flight attendant retreated to economy. "It's like watching ripples in a pond," Amy observed quietly. "One incident, but look how it spreads. That flight attendant just now, she didn't even know what happened, but she could feel something was different." The elderly woman, who had introduced herself as Margaret, leaned across the aisle again. "My grandson is starting college this fall," she said. "He wants to go into aviation. He's mixed race, and I worry about things like this happening to him." Darren turned towards her, his expression softening. "Tell him to do it anyway. Things are changing, even if it doesn't always feel like it. Every person who pushes through makes it a little easier for the next one." As the flight progressed, Darren noticed subtle changes in how people moved through the cabin. Passengers who had been absorbed in their phones or laptops were now more aware of their surroundings, more conscious of their interactions. A man returning from the bathroom nodded to him with deliberate respect. A woman asking for a blanket made eye contact with every crew member, as if trying to demonstrate her lack of prejudice. Lisa had yet to return to the front cabin, but through the gaps between seats, Darren could occasionally see her in economy, working with an almost frantic efficiency. Her face still carried the shocked expression of someone whose world had been abruptly reorganized. "You know what's interesting?" James said, breaking a lengthy silence. "Everyone here is acting different now because they know who you are. But that's exactly what you were talking about before, changing behavior based on status rather than basic respect." A younger passenger, who hadn't spoken before, joined in. "Yeah, but maybe that's how change starts? Like, this whole thing is uncomfortable, but maybe we need to feel uncomfortable to actually learn something." Sarah returned to check on drinks, her movements precise, but her usual professional distance somewhat thawed. As she refilled Darren's glass, she paused. "Mr. Evans, some of the economy passengers heard about what happened. They're asking if you're really the owner's son." Darren couldn't help but smile slightly. "And now I'm a rumor spreading through the plane at 30,000 feet. His comment broke some of the tension, drawing chuckles from nearby passengers. The rest of the first-class cabin seemed to have given up any pretense of not listening to the ongoing conversations. Even those who hadn't directly participated were clearly absorbed in the unfolding discussion, their bodies turned slightly toward the exchanges, their own quiet conversations touching on similar themes. The flight had reached its comfortable cruising rhythm when Amy leaned forward again, her corporate trainer instincts clearly engaged. "You mentioned this happens in more subtle ways usually. Would you mind sharing some examples? It could help people recognize when they're doing it themselves." Darren considered for a moment, stirring his drink. "Well, there was the time I was doing a pre-flight walk-around in my pilot's uniform, and a passenger complained to ground staff about a suspicious person inspecting the aircraft." He smiled slightly at the memory. "Or when I'm in civilian clothes in the cockpit doing paperwork and other crew members assume I'm lost." James shook his head, his coffee forgotten. "That must be exhausting, constantly having to prove you belong somewhere you clearly belong." "You learn to pick your battles," Darren replied. "Sometimes you speak up, sometimes you let it go. But yeah, it gets tiring." He glanced out the window at the clouds below. "The weird part is how you start to anticipate it. Like this morning, I knew something might happen when I sat down. You just don't know exactly what or when." Margaret shifted in her seat to face the conversation better. "My grandson, the one going into aviation, he told me something similar. He said he has to think about things that his friends don't, like what to wear to the airport, so he doesn't look suspicious." She made air quotes around the last words, her face showing how ridiculous she found the concept. A man who had been quietly listening spoke up. "I work in HR for a tech company," he said, introducing himself as David. "We've been trying to improve our diversity hiring, but I'm realizing now we might be missing the bigger picture. Getting people in the door is one thing, but what about all these little moments after?" "That's exactly it," Darren nodded. "It's not just about hiring numbers or policies. It's about the day-to-day experience. The small interactions, the assumptions, the extra effort it takes to just exist in certain spaces. Sarah, who had been nearby arranging drinks, paused in her work. I've been thinking about all the times I might have made assumptions about passengers without realizing it. Maybe not as obvious as what happened today, but still. That's actually a good sign. Amy chimed in, her professional expertise showing. Recognizing our potential for bias is the first step. The problem is when people get defensive and refuse to acknowledge it could happen to them. The conversation was interrupted briefly as they hit a patch of turbulence. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and everyone adjusted their drinks and laptops. When the air smoothed out again, David picked up the thread. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said. "The fact that you didn't immediately pull out your ID when this started. You let it play out. Why?" Darren took a moment before answering. "Because flashing my ID or name-dropping my father might have stopped that specific situation, but it wouldn't have changed anything real. Lisa would have just been embarrassed about picking the wrong person to profile, not about profiling in general." The truth of his words settled over the cabin. James nodded slowly, understanding dawning on his face. "So, when you did show your ID, it wasn't about proving your right to be there. It was about making a point about assumptions," Darren finished. "About showing how quickly someone's treatment of you can change based on external factors that have nothing to do with your humanity." Amy was typing rapidly on her phone, then looked up. "You know what's powerful about this situation? Everyone here experienced it differently. Some people stayed quiet, some spoke up, some just watched. But nobody can pretend it didn't happen. And we all have to decide what we're going to do with this experience," Margaret added, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen both progress and setbacks in her lifetime. A younger passenger who had been quiet throughout the flight finally spoke up. "I kept thinking about what I would have done if I was Lisa. I'd like to think I wouldn't make those assumptions, but how do you really know until you're in that situation?" "That's the thing about bias," Darren said. "It's not always about being a bad person. Sometimes it's about the assumptions we don't even realize we're making until something forces us to see them." The conversations continued to branch out, with different groups forming and reforming as people shared their own experiences and reflections. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had transformed into something like an impromptu workshop on human behavior and prejudice, taking place at 35,000 feet. As the flight entered its final hour, Lisa emerged from the back of the plane. Her earlier flustered energy had been replaced by something more subdued, more thoughtful. She stood in the galley for several minutes, organizing and reorganizing the same drawer, clearly working up the courage to do something. Finally, she walked slowly to Darren's seat. The conversations around them quieted, passengers pretending to be absorbed in books or devices while staying acutely aware of what was happening. Lisa's hands were steady now, but her face showed the internal struggle of someone facing a difficult truth about themselves. "Mr. Evans," she said quietly, "could I speak with you for a moment?" Her voice carried none of the artificial customer service brightness from earlier. Instead, there was a raw honesty that made several nearby passengers look up. Darren nodded, turning slightly in his seat to face her. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the cabin, creating an oddly intimate atmosphere for what was about to unfold. "I've been in the back, thinking about what happened," Lisa began. She paused, searching for the right words. "At first, I was just embarrassed about not recognizing you. But then I realized that was exactly the problem, thinking that treating someone with respect should depend on recognizing their status." She took a deep breath before continuing. "The truth is, I made assumptions about you the moment I saw you in that seat. I didn't even realize I was doing it until it all played out the way it did. And that's not okay." Darren watched her carefully, seeing the genuine struggle behind her words. Around them, the cabin had grown notably quiet, even the usual airplane white noise seeming to fade into the background. "I've been a flight attendant for 6 years, Lisa continued, her voice steady despite her obvious discomfort. "I've always prided myself on providing good service. But today made me realize that maybe what I thought was good service was actually selective service, based on what I expected people to look like or be like." She glanced briefly at the other passengers, most of whom were now openly watching the exchange. I heard some of the conversations that have been happening up here, about bias and assumptions, and she swallowed hard. And I realized I'm exactly what everyone's been talking about. The person who doesn't think they're prejudiced, but acts on prejudices anyway. James, who had been pretending to read a magazine, put it down entirely. Amy stopped typing on her phone. Even Margaret removed her reading glasses, all of them recognizing the importance of this moment. I could make excuses, Lisa went on, about being tired or busy, or just trying to maintain standards. But the truth is, I saw a young black man in first class, and I automatically assumed there had been a mistake. That's on me. And I'm not just sorry because you turned out to be the owner's son. I'm sorry because it was wrong, period. Darren let her words hang in the air for a moment before responding. Thank you, Lisa. That couldn't have been easy to say. His voice was kind but carried the weight of someone who had heard many apologies before. What matters now is what you do with this awareness. Lisa nodded, wiping quickly at her eyes. I keep thinking about how many other times I might have done something similar without even realizing it. How many people I might have made feel unwelcome or uncomfortable because of my assumptions. That's actually a good place to start, Darren said. Questioning our automatic responses, thinking about why we react the way we do. It's not comfortable, but it's necessary. Sarah had appeared quietly beside them, listening to the exchange. Maybe this is something we need to address more directly in our training, she suggested. Not just general diversity statements, but real conversations about these everyday moments. The thing is, Lisa added, her voice stronger now, I always thought I was one of the good ones, you know? Not racist, not prejudiced. But today showed me that it's not that simple. These biases can run so deep we don't even notice them until they're right in front of our faces. A younger flight attendant passing through the cabin slowed down to listen, her own expression thoughtful. Around them, other passengers were nodding slightly, perhaps recognizing similar revelations in their own lives. The fact that you're willing to acknowledge it and learn from it, that matters, Darren said. It's easy to get defensive or try to explain it away. Taking responsibility is harder, but it's the only way things actually change. As the plane began its descent into the afternoon sun, there was a different energy in the cabin than when they'd taken off that morning. The usual end-of-flight routines were happening, laptops being stowed, seats returning to their upright positions, but conversations continued in hushed tones, passengers exchanging meaningful glances. Darren packed away his things slowly, aware of how this flight had turned into something none of them had expected. The crew moved through the cabin with a new consciousness, their interactions with every passenger more thoughtful, more present. Lisa had returned to her duties, but there was a visible change in how she carried herself, in how she addressed each person regardless of appearance or seat assignment. You know, James said, closing his briefcase, I've probably taken over 1,000 flights in my career, but I don't think I'll forget this one. He paused, then added, I keep thinking about all the times I've seen similar situations and just buried my head in my laptop. Amy leaned forward one last time. Would you be willing to stay in touch? I think what happened today could really help other organizations understand these issues better. Sometimes people need to see real examples to understand how these dynamics play out. Margaret, who had been quiet for a while, spoke up again. I'm going to call my grandson tonight. Tell him about this flight. About how sometimes standing your ground quietly can be more powerful than making a scene. The landing gear dropped with a familiar thud, and the city came into view below them. As they descended, Darren noticed several crew members gathering near the front galley, engaged in serious discussion. Sarah seemed to be leading the conversation, gesturing in a way that suggested she was already thinking about how to prevent similar incidents in the future. Approaching final descent, the captain's voice announced over the intercom. The routine words carried through a cabin that felt anything but routine. Several passengers who hadn't been directly involved in the earlier conversations were still watching Darren, their expressions suggesting they'd been processing everything they'd witnessed. David, the HR manager, finished typing something on his phone before stowing it. I've just sent myself a note to review our company's training programs first thing Monday morning, he said. We focus so much on big policy issues. We sometimes miss these everyday moments that really shape people's experiences. A flight attendant they hadn't seen before came through for the final check. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as she made eye contact with each passenger, conscious of treating everyone with equal attention. Word had clearly spread through the entire crew, creating immediate changes in behavior. Sometimes, Darren said, watching this play out, change happens in small moments like these. It's not always about big announcements or policy changes. Sometimes it's just about people witnessing something that makes them think differently. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling past terminals filled with travelers starting their own journeys. As they taxied to their gate, Lisa appeared one last time, her composure restored, but her demeanor forever changed. "Mr. Evans," she said softly, "thank you. Not just for accepting my apology, but for making me see something I needed to see." She glanced around at the other passengers. "I think you made a lot of us see things we needed to see." As passengers began gathering their belongings, the conversations continued. Numbers were exchanged, connections made. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had transformed into a moment of collective growth, even if some passengers had remained silent observers throughout. Darren waited until most others had deplaned before standing up. Several crew members had gathered near the exit, including the captain who had apparently heard about what happened. Their expressions carried a mix of respect and regret, understanding that while they couldn't change what had happened, they could change what happened next. Walking through the terminal toward his conference, Darren felt both tired and hopeful. He pulled out his phone to text his father, knowing he'd want to hear about what happened. But instead of focusing on the negative aspect of the incident, Darren found himself typing about the conversations that followed, about Lisa's genuine apology, about the way people came together to learn from an uncomfortable moment. As he approached the conference center, he could see other industry professionals arriving, their badges marking them as pilots, executives, engineers. Darren touched his own badge, thinking about how many others might have similar stories to share. He made a mental note to find a way to work this experience into his presentations, knowing that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the stories we're least eager to tell. After all, change rarely happens in grand gestures. It happens in moments like these, in quiet stands, in honest apologies, in uncomfortable revelations that force us to confront our own biases. And sometimes, at 35,000 feet, strangers can become unexpected teachers, learning together how to build a better world, one flight at a time.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.